wind arrived without warning. It came down from the high peaks of the Rocky Mountains, carrying with it the particular cold that doesn't announce itself in degrees, but in the way it settles into bone and tendon in the spaces between thoughts. The kind of cold that makes a man reconsider what he knows about endurance. Captain Evelyn Thorne felt it the moment she stepped off the transport helicopter. January in the Colorado high country, 14 below zero and falling. The firebase was a collection of prefabricated structures and blast walls carved into the southern slope of a ridge that had no name on any civilian map. Pine forest climbed steeply on three sides. To the north, the slope fell away into a valley that disappeared into low cloud, the kind of landscape that seemed designed specifically to swallow people and keep what it took. She carried her pack in her left hand and the rifle in her right. The Springfield Model 1903 walnut stock, iron sights, with a period-correct Lyman scope mounted above the action. The bluing had worn through in places, leaving patches of silver where 81 years of hands had rested. She had relined the barrel herself 2 years ago, fitted a new trigger group, lapped the bolt face until the headspace was perfect to within 0.02 of an inch. Nobody watching her arrival would know that. They saw old wood and old steel, and they drew their conclusions accordingly. 7th Operational Detachment had been in place for 16 days, running reconnaissance patrols and establishing observation posts along a network of routes that intelligence analysts suspected were being used to move supplies and personnel through the mountain corridor. The mission was quiet work. Watch, record, withdraw. No contact if possible. The kind of operation where success was measured in the quality of information gathered rather than the volume of ammunition expended. Evelyn had been attached to the detachment 4 days ago as a designated marksman asset, borrowed from a unit operating 60 kilometers to the east. She had arrived alone, carrying her own equipment. She had signed into the logbook, stowed her gear in an empty bunk space, and asked where the cleaning supplies were kept. She was 34 years old. Her service record noted 14 years in uniform, 3 combat deployments, and a marksmanship qualification score that had caused an administrative officer in Quantico to check the scoring system twice before signing off on it. What the service record did not note was that she had grown up on a cattle ranch in western Montana, that she had fired her first centerfire cartridge at age 7, or that the Springfield had belonged to her grandfather, who had carried it home from a war that ended 3 years before her father was born. The operations center was warm after the razor edge of the wind outside. Colonel James Kellerman stood near the map table, a man of severe economy in both movement and expression, 72 years old, with the bearing of someone whose spine had been forged in circumstances that did not accommodate weakness. He looked up when she entered, and his eyes went immediately to the rifle. "Captain Thorne," he said. His voice carried the particular rasp of a man who had spent decades giving orders in conditions that required volume. "Welcome to Firebase Coldstone." She set her pack down and came to attention. "Sir." Kellerman walked around the map table. He moved the way very old soldiers sometimes moved, each step deliberate, as though his body was a piece of equipment he had learned to maintain through careful discipline. He stopped 3 feet from her and studied the Springfield with the expression of a man encountering something he had not expected to see again. "Your grandfather was Nathaniel Thorne," he said. It was not a question. "Yes, sir. I served with him. Chosin Reservoir, November and December of 1950. 1st Marine Division, surrounded by 8 Chinese divisions in minus 35-degree weather. Your grandfather saved my life on the morning of November 29th. I was 18 years old, and I had frozen to my rifle. Literally frozen. Moisture from my breath had condensed on the metal and turned to ice, and I could not operate the bolt. A Chinese sniper had our position ranged, and I was about to die in a very stupid way." Kellerman reached out and touched the Springfield stock, just behind the pistol grip, where the wood was darkest. Nathaniel put 7 rounds through a gap in the rocks no wider than a dinner plate, At a distance I could not even see clearly. He eliminated that sniper and two others within 90 seconds. Then he looked at me and said, "Son, the rifle doesn't know what calendar year it is. It only knows what you ask of it." He taught me the 12-minute repositioning rule that morning. I have carried that lesson for 74 years. Evelyn said nothing. There was nothing to say. The story was true. She had heard a version of it from her grandfather before he died, though he had never mentioned Kellerman by name. "I requested you specifically for this operation," Kellerman said. "Command thought I was senile. They asked why I wanted a designated marksman carrying a rifle that belongs in a museum when we have access to the most advanced sniper systems in the world. I told them that in severe conditions, I trust depth of mastery over breadth of technology. They approved the request because I am too old to argue with, but they think I am making a mistake." He stepped back and looked at her directly. "Your father was Graham Thorne. He carried that same rifle in Desert Storm. He tried to tell his command that simple mechanical systems have an advantage when conditions degrade. They did not listen. The technology failed him. He died because someone believed that new was automatically better than proven." The operations center was quiet, except for the low hum of generators and the distant sound of wind against the walls. "Let me be clear, Captain," Kellerman said. "I asked you here to prove a point that has needed proving for 70 years. Show them what your grandfather showed me. Show them that mastery matters." "Yes, sir." Kellerman nodded once and returned to the map table. "Intelligence briefing at 06:30 tomorrow. Get settled. There is coffee in the common area that tastes like battery acid, but it is hot." The common area was a long, modular structure with tables and chairs that had been bolted to the floor to survive transport. A dozen soldiers from the detachment were scattered throughout the space, some reading, some cleaning equipment, some simply staring at nothing in particular, with the expression of people whose minds were elsewhere. Evelyn found an empty corner and set the Springfield on the table. She opened her pack and removed the cleaning kit, a compact roll of tools and supplies that she had assembled over 25 years. The kit was older than some of the soldiers in the room. She broke down the rifle with the fluid economy of someone who had performed the same sequence of movements several thousand times. Action from stock, bolt from action, scope from mount. Each component was inspected, each surface examined in the light. She threaded a patch through the bore and ran it through twice, then held the muzzle up to catch the light and inspected the lands and grooves with the patience of someone who understood that shortcuts were just failures that had not happened yet. "Serious question," the voice came from her left. A young soldier, maybe 26, with the confidence of someone whose skills were real, but whose awareness of the limits of those skills had not yet caught up. "Specialist rank insignia. Does that thing actually fire, or is it just for show?" Evelyn pulled the patch through and set it aside. She looked at him for a moment with the expression of a woman deciding whether a response was worth the energy expenditure. "It shoots," she said. "To what effective range?" "Sufficient." The specialist looked at the rifle, then at his own weapon, leaning against the wall nearby. A precision rifle with a suppressor, modular furniture, and a thermal optic that cost more than most people earned in a month. The contrast was almost comical. He smiled, not unkindly, and let the subject drop. But the smile had been enough. Two other soldiers in the room, a sergeant and a staff sergeant, had registered it. Small social transactions like that have a long half-life in close quarters. They accumulate in the corners of rooms and in the pauses between conversations, building pressure the way snow builds on a cornice before the collapse. Evelyn worked through the evening routine. Clean, inspect, reassemble, function, check. Her hands moved without requiring supervision from her conscious mind. This was the inheritance. Not just the rifle, but the knowledge of the rifle. The accumulated understanding of its geometry and its tolerances, and the ways in which it responded to pressure and temperature and time. Her grandfather had taught her that a tool was only as good as the depth of knowledge the user brought to it. that a man with a $10,000 rifle and a poor understanding would miss, while a man with a 50-year-old rifle and a perfect understanding would not. He had spent 32 years learning the Springfield before he passed it to her father. Her father had spent 10 years with it before Desert Storm. She had been working with it for 25 years, and she was still learning. The engraving was just behind the pistol grip, where a right-handed shooter's thumb would naturally rest. 3 sets of initials, carved with care into the wood. N-G-E, Thorn. Nathaniel, Graham, Evelyn. 3 generations, 3 wars, 1 rifle. She ran her thumb across the letters and thought about her father. He had been 32 when he died, killed in a friendly fire incident when the night vision systems on 2 vehicles failed simultaneously, and neither crew could identify the other in the darkness. The after-action report had noted equipment malfunction as a contributing factor. It had recommended additional training on backup identification procedures. It had not recommended reconsidering the reliability of complex systems in adverse conditions. Her father had tried to explain it before he deployed. He had told her that simple mechanical systems had a fundamental advantage when conditions became severe enough. That electronics failed, that batteries died. That moisture and cold and sand and heat degraded the systems that people had come to depend on. And when those systems failed, what remained was the human and the human's understanding of the tool. He had been right. The report had proven him right. But he had died anyway, and the lesson had not been learned. Evelyn reassembled the Springfield and set it on the table. Outside, the wind had picked up. Snow was beginning to fall, small, hard flakes driven at an angle by the gusts. The temperature was dropping. By morning, it would be -20 or worse. She slept 4 hours and woke to darkness and the sound of movement in the bunk area. Other soldiers preparing for the day shift, moving quietly in the way that people learn to move when they share close quarters. She dressed, checked her equipment, and walked to the operations center through snow that had accumulated 3 inches during the night. The briefing room was crowded. Kellerman stood at the front near a large display screen showing satellite imagery of the forest northeast of the firebase. Evelyn found a place near the back and listened. As of 0400 this morning, Kellerman said, Signals Intelligence has identified a precision fire element moving into the operational area. 8 to 10 individuals, experienced marksmen, organized as a dedicated long-range harassment unit. Their purpose is to degrade our ability to operate in the valley by engaging personnel and equipment at extended range. He tapped the screen, and the image zoomed in on a section of forest. They are not amateurs. The intercept makes that clear. These are professionals, possibly former military or private contractors. Intelligence also suggests. He paused, and Evelyn saw something change in his expression, a tightening around the eyes that indicated discomfort with what he was about to say. There is a possibility that one of them is Maxwell Briggs, former Delta Force operator, went dark after the Kabul withdrawal in 2021. If it is Briggs, your thermal optics will not provide the advantage you expect. He knows our doctrine. He knows our equipment. He knows how we think. Murmurs moved through the room. Evelyn watched the faces of the soldiers around her. Some showed concern. Some showed skepticism. Some showed the careful blankness of people who had learned not to show anything at all. Sergeant Donovan will lead a reconnaissance patrol into the area at 0900, Kellerman continued. 5-man element. Objective is to locate the precision fire element, establish their positions, and withdraw for a fire mission or air support. Captain Thorne will be attached as the designated marksman asset. The specialist from the previous evening, whose name Evelyn had learned was Garrett Hutchins, turned slightly in his seat and looked back at her. His expression said what his mouth did not. He thought this was a mistake. He thought the old rifle was a liability. He thought she was going to get someone killed. The briefing continued for another 20 minutes. Routes, communications protocols, contingency plans, extraction points. The language of operational planning, precise and bloodless, and entirely insufficient to capture what was actually going to happen when human beings with rifles tried to kill each other in a frozen forest. When the briefing ended, soldiers filed out into the cold morning. Evelyn remained in her seat. Kellerman approached and sat down beside her. "Your grandfather asked me a question at Chosin," he said quietly. He said, "Dutch, when the world gets fancy and complicated, does true mastery still matter, or does it become obsolete?" I was 18. I did not know how to answer. I said I would have to think about it. He looked at the Springfield, which Evelyn had leaned against the chair beside her. 74 years, Kellerman said. "I have been thinking about it for 74 years. Today, I would very much like to have an answer." Evelyn picked up the rifle and stood. "Yes, sir." She walked out into the morning. The snow had stopped, but the wind remained, a constant pressure from the northwest. The forest waited, dark and silent and indifferent to the intentions of the people preparing to enter it. The patrol assembled at the wire at 0845. Sergeant First Class Blake Donovan was a solid professional with 10 years of experience in the kind of calm that came from having survived enough situations to understand the difference between genuine danger and perceived danger. He checked equipment, verified radio frequencies, and went through the pre-patrol checklist with methodical precision. Staff Sergeant Wyatt Sterling took point. Private First Class Casey Sullivan carried the medical pack. Specialist Garrett Hutchins carried a precision rifle with a thermal optic and enough technological capability to range and engage targets at distances that would have seemed like science fiction 30 years ago. Evelyn carried the Springfield. Garrett looked at it one more time before they moved out. He did not say anything, but his face said everything. That rifle was 81 years old. It had no thermal capability. It had no laser rangefinder. It had no ballistic computer. It had iron sights and a scope with glass lenses and mechanical adjustments. And if something went wrong out there, if they got into contact and needed precision fire at distance, that rifle was going to be the reason someone did not come home. Evelyn checked the chamber, checked the scope, and slung the rifle across her back. She looked at Garrett and saw a young man who had been taught to trust his equipment more than his skills, and who had never been in a situation severe enough to learn the difference. "Ready," she said. They moved into the forest at 0900 exactly. The trees swallowed them within 200 meters. The world reduced to gray light filtered through pine branches, to the sound of snow compressing under boots, to the particular alertness that comes from knowing that somewhere ahead, people with rifles were waiting. The temperature was -14 and falling. The cold was not the worst Evelyn had experienced, but it was severe enough to matter. Metal became painful to touch with bare skin. Breath rose in visible clouds. The weapons carried by the patrol, with their complex electronics and their batteries and their delicate optical systems, were operating at the edge of their environmental tolerances. The Springfield did not care about the cold. This was its particular genius. It had been designed in an era when reliability could not be solved by adding more technology. The action was simple. The tolerances were generous enough to accommodate thermal expansion and contraction. The trigger had been fitted and tuned by someone who understood the relationship between pull weight and cold, stiffened fingers. It was a rifle that had been perfected through 2 world wars and 100 smaller conflicts, refined by the accumulated experience of millions of soldiers who had carried it in every climate and every condition that the planet could produce. They moved slowly. Every footfall had to be placed with care, because snow was both concealment and hazard. A sound at the wrong moment in the wrong place could collapse the entire mission into chaos. Wyatt led with the careful precision of a man who understood that speed was worthless if it meant walking into an ambush. 40 minutes into the patrol, Blake raised his fist. Everyone froze. Silence. The wind in the upper branches. The creak of trees adjusting to the weight of accumulated snow. Nothing else. Blake moved forward, gesturing for Wyatt to hold position. The two men conferred in hand signals for several seconds. Then Blake turned and signaled the patrol to hold in place. 7 minutes passed. Evelyn used the time to scan the forest, to read the terrain, to look for the small things that indicated human presence. The disturbed snow, the unnatural color, the angle of light on glass or metal. She saw nothing, but the absence of evidence was not the same as evidence of absence. Then the crack came. High-velocity, supersonic crack, the sound arriving a fraction of a second after the bullet passed close. Casey went down without a sound. Not dead. The round had caught him in the thigh, below the plate carrier, in the gap that body armor was never quite able to cover completely. He went down and immediately rolled behind a tree trunk, which was the training taking over, the body executing the response that had been drilled into muscle memory. Everyone else was behind cover in 2 seconds. The shot had been perfect. Not the shot of someone panicking or guessing. It had come from elevation, from behind and to the left, which meant the element was already farther around their flank than the imagery had suggested. The shooter had waited, had watched them for several minutes, and had chosen his moment with professional discipline. Evelyn had moved to cover, but not the same cover as the rest of the patrol. She had moved laterally to a large pine trunk on the eastern side of the patrol's path, and she was scanning, looking for the things that would tell her where the shot had originated. The angle of Casey's wound, the sound of the report delayed by distance, the way the birds had scattered from a particular section of the forest. Blake had his radio out. Coldstone, contact, 1 casualty, stable. We are under effective fire from... The drone went up 70 seconds later. Garrett's operator, a young private whose hands were shaking slightly from adrenaline, had the quadcopter airborne within a minute. It made it 90 seconds before something intersected its flight path, and it fell in 3 pieces into the snow 40 meters from the patrol's position. No sound, no warning. One moment it was transmitting a clear image, and the next moment the feed was black. Nobody said anything about that. There was nothing to say. Someone out there had just eliminated their reconnaissance capability with a single shot at a moving aerial target the size of a dinner plate. Evelyn was watching the light. There was a particular quality to the way winter sun, low and gray in the southwest, struck snow at certain angles. Under certain atmospheric conditions, a lens, even a good coated lens, would produce a faint bloom of reflected light when the angle was exactly right. It lasted less than a second. It was the kind of thing that registered in peripheral vision and vanished before the conscious mind could catch up. She had been registering peripheral flickers for the past 4 minutes. Northeast and northwest. Multiple positions. She moved low and fast to Blake's position. They're already northeast and northwest of us, she said quietly. 3 positions minimum. We're inside their engagement envelope. Blake looked at her, then at the tree line, then back at her. How certain? Certain enough to tell you before we move. He was silent for a moment. The only sound was the wind in the upper branches, and very faintly, Casey's controlled breathing as Wyatt applied a tourniquet to his leg. What do you recommend? Blake asked. Evelyn did not answer immediately. She was looking at the snow, reading it, looking for the patterns that would tell her where they had walked, where the enemy had positioned, what the terrain would allow. The explosion came from above, not a munition, a cornice, a massive shelf of overloaded snow on the eastern slope above them, released without warning, and the sound of it was like a freight train derailing in slow motion. Blake shouted something. Wyatt was already moving. Evelyn turned toward the sound and understood in a fraction of a second what was happening and what it meant. The slope was not steep enough to kill them outright, but it was more than steep enough to send several thousand kilograms of consolidated snow and ice debris cascading through their position. It would separate the patrol, destroy any coherent formation, and make the next 60 seconds purely about survival rather than tactics. She moved uphill. It was the only direction that made sense. The snow hit her from behind, a cold, massive pressure that took her off her feet and dragged her sideways. She kept her grip on the Springfield. Everything else was physics. She went down, went under, came back up. She got her hands beneath her and pushed and found solid ground and stood. The forest was silent. She was alone. She could hear, faintly and at some distance, the sounds of people moving, branches breaking, someone calling a name. The voices were below her and to the west. The avalanche had carried her at least 60 meters from her last position. The terrain had reorganized itself. Nothing looked the same. She keyed her radio. Static. She tried the alternate frequency. More static. The avalanche had either damaged her radio, or more likely, she was now on the wrong side of a ridgeline that was blocking the signal. She checked the radio housing. Cracked. The antenna bent at an angle that would make transmission unreliable at best. She stayed still for 2 minutes and listened. From the northeast, the direction they had been moving, she heard nothing, which meant either the precision fire element was also in motion, repositioning after the Cornice release, or they were still in waiting. Both possibilities were equally dangerous. Below her, through a gap in the trees, she saw a thermal flare arc into the gray sky and burn for 3 seconds. Blake's emergency signal. She understood what it meant. They thought she was under the snow. They were marking the position for recovery. She tried the radio again. Nothing. The wind was picking up. The temperature was dropping. Somewhere in the northeast quadrant of the forest, at minimum 8 people were hunting. They had already demonstrated their capability. They had engaged the patrol from an unexpected position. They had destroyed the drone with a single shot. They had possibly triggered the avalanche deliberately to create chaos. She could wait for extraction. She could work her way back toward the firebase alone, abandoning the mission entirely. She looked northeast, into the forest, into the gray light and the silent trees and the particular cold that made steel brittle and electronics unreliable, and human judgment the only thing that mattered. Her grandfather had faced situations like this. Chosin Reservoir, surrounded, outnumbered, equipment failing in the extreme cold. He had not withdrawn. He had done his job. Her father had believed in the philosophy that simple systems, properly understood, would function when complex systems failed. He had died because others did not share that belief. But the belief had been correct. She checked the Springfield, cycled the action, verified that the scope was clear. The rifle was cold, but it was functional. It would remain functional at -40. It would remain functional at -50. It had been designed for this. Evelyn Thorne began to move northeast, into enemy territory, alone. She changed position every 12 minutes. This was not arbitrary. 12 minutes was the outer edge of the window within which a trained observer who had lost visual contact with a target could realistically reacquire. Too short and you never established a stable firing position. Too long and you became predictable. 12 minutes was the number her grandfather had taught her. Learn through experience in terrain exactly like this. And the number had been correct in every situation she had encountered since. The forest here was different from where the patrol had been operating. The trees were tighter, younger, with lower branches that made standing shots difficult, but created excellent concealment at ground level. The snowpack was deeper, 30 centimeters or more in the protected areas, which changed the acoustics entirely. Sound that would have traveled freely in open terrain was absorbed and scattered by the snow, creating dead zones where a person could move almost silently if they understood how to place their weight. Evelyn moved through these zones with the deliberate care of someone who had spent 25 years learning to read terrain. She watched where the snow had consolidated under its own weight, where it remained powder dry, where the underlying ground was likely to be stable. She listened to the forest, to the way wind moved through the branches, to the absence of bird calls that might indicate recent human presence. 43 minutes after the avalanche, she found the first one by mistake. She was crossing a shallow depression when she saw the shape. A white-clad figure, prone on a fallen log, facing northeast, away from her position. He was watching the valley below, waiting for Blake's patrol to emerge from the trees. He had not anticipated anyone coming from the direction of the avalanche zone. Evelyn stopped breathing. He had not heard her. The snow underfoot here was consolidated, not the dry powder that would creak and groan under pressure. She had been lucky, or careful, or both. She moved left, uphill, slowly, until she had a clean line and enough elevation to ensure that her shot would terminate in the hillside, rather than traveling through the trees toward the valley where Blake's team might be regrouping. The movement took 4 minutes. Every step was a calculation of weight distribution and sound management. The distance was approximately 400 meters. Not a difficult shot under ordinary conditions. Under these conditions, with a cold barrel, in a crosswind, at altitude where air density was uncertain and variable, it required perfect understanding of the rifle's ballistic characteristics and her own ability to read the environment correctly. She settled into the snow behind a granite outcropping. The cold seeped through her clothing immediately, but cold was irrelevant. What mattered was stability. What mattered was the natural respiratory pause at the bottom of the exhale cycle. What mattered was the trigger brake occurring at exactly the moment she intended, and not a fraction of a second before or after. She found the natural pause. The reticle settled on the center mass of the white-clad figure. The wind was low, variable, predominantly from the southwest at perhaps 3 kilometers per hour. At this distance, with this cartridge, the wind drift would be negligible, less than 2 centimeters. The cold air was denser than standard atmosphere, which would reduce bullet drop slightly, perhaps 1 centimeter at 400 meters. The trigger broke. The Springfield's report was sharp and clean in the cold air. The white-clad figure did not move again. Evelyn was already repositioning before the echo came back from the far ridge. 6 seconds later, she was behind a different tree, facing a different direction, listening. The forest told her things. A sudden silence to the northeast, birds that had been moving through the canopy, going still. A pause in the wind that lasted exactly long enough for sound to travel from that direction to this one. Somewhere between 300 and 500 meters away, in terrain that gave her no visual contact, at least 2 people had just heard a shot and were deciding what it meant. Whether it had come from their own element or from someone else. Whether it represented a threat or merely a development in a fluid situation. She gave them 8 minutes to decide. Then she moved again. At Firebase Coldstone, Colonel Kellerman stood in the operations center with his hands behind his back, watching the radio operator attempt to reestablish contact with the patrol. The young specialist tried every frequency, every protocol, and received nothing but static in return. "Sir," the operator said, "I'm not getting anything. Either their equipment is damaged or they're in a terrain shadow." Blake Donovan's voice crackled through on the emergency frequency, broken and intermittent. "Coldstone, regrouped, 1 casualty stable, thorns separated, cornice collapse. Believe she's—" The transmission dissolved into static. Kellerman leaned forward. "Say again your last, Sergeant." More static. Then faintly, "Under the snow, marking position, request." The transmission cut out entirely. Garrett Hutchins stood near the map table, his face showing something that might have been guilt, or might have been fear, or might have been both. "Sir, if she's buried, we need to get a recovery team out there immediately." Kellerman did not respond. He was listening to something else, a sound that carried across the valley, faint but unmistakable. The sharp crack of a rifle report, distinctly different from the modern suppressed weapons the patrol carried. The radio operator looked up. "Sir, what was—" "Log it," Kellerman said. 0947 hours, Springfield report. Garrett looked confused. "How can you tell what type of rifle it was from here?" Kellerman's expression did not change. "I heard that sound 700 times at Chosin Reservoir, specialist. I know what a Springfield sounds like." He paused, still listening. "She's not under the snow. She's working. 3 minutes later, the intelligence update arrived. The signals analyst, a captain with dark circles under her eyes from too many consecutive shifts, brought the printed intercept to Kellerman personally. "Sir, we just picked up enemy communications. One hostile confirmed KIA. The others are requesting emergency extraction. Someone is systematically eliminating them." Kellerman read the intercept twice. Then he looked at the map, at the area where the patrol had been operating, at the terrain features that would dictate movement and line of sight. He traced a possible route with his finger, northeast from the avalanche zone, following the ridgeline. "How many confirmed eliminations?" he asked. "One confirmed, but the chatter suggests they're confused, disorganized. Someone they didn't expect is engaging them effectively." Kellerman nodded slowly. "Captain Thorne is doing what I asked her to do. She's proving a point." In the forest, the blizzard arrived the way serious weather always arrived in these mountains. Not gradually, but suddenly, as though the sky had been deliberating and had finally reached a decision. The temperature dropped 4 degrees in 10 minutes. The wind shifted from the southwest to the northwest, bringing it down from the higher peaks where the real cold lived. And then the snow came. Not the gentle postcard snow of lower elevations. This was horizontal snow, small, hard flakes driven at speed, a blunt instrument deployed by weather systems that had no interest in being picturesque. Visibility, which had been tolerable at 200 meters, dropped to 50 in the first 5 minutes, then to 30, then to less than that. Evelyn took stock of the tactical situation. The blizzard was bad for her and bad for them, but it was differently bad. For her, it compressed the effective engagement range and removed the advantage of distance at which the Springfield excelled. For them, it removed the advantage of their thermal optics. Thermal imaging required a temperature differential between target and background. In a ground blizzard with wind chill approaching -40, that differential collapsed. The expensive electronics became expensive glass, no more useful than her scope and considerably more fragile. She made a decision that could not be easily explained through conventional tactical doctrine. She moved deeper into the storm rather than seeking shelter from it. There was a logic to this, but it was the logic of someone who had spent thousands of hours in terrain like this, who understood that the correct response to a degraded environment was sometimes to inhabit it completely rather than to resist it. The enemy would shelter. They would find positions where the storm was partially blocked by terrain or vegetation, and they would wait for conditions to improve. This made them predictable. This made them findable. She was listening now in a way that required her entire body, not just her ears, but her feet registering vibration through the snowpack, her hands feeling the directional changes in wind that sometimes preceded a sound by a fraction of a second, her skin sensing the pressure waves that indicated movement nearby. She heard the first one before she saw him, a compression of sound to her right, the particular crunch of a boot breaking through a crust layer in snow, the sound of someone moving with purpose, but without the training to move silently in these conditions. She stopped. She measured the angle and distance by ear, the way her grandfather had taught her she could in sufficient quiet. Approximately 40 meters away, moving north, perpendicular to her own position. She counted to 7. Then from a direction entirely different, a second sound, not footsteps, a shot, not aimed at her, aimed at where the first sound had come from. In the whiteout, with visibility reduced to almost nothing, one of them had just shot at his own teammate. The white camouflage that had been an advantage in normal conditions had become a liability in the blizzard. They could not identify each other. Evelyn did not move for 30 seconds. She let the situation develop. There were voices, brief and sharp, impossible to make out the words but clear in their tone. Confusion, alarm, then a second shot, deliberate this time. Someone finishing what the first shot had started. Then silence. The silence of a mistake that had become certainty. She adjusted her count. 1 eliminated by her rifle before the blizzard. won by their own confusion just now. 6 remaining from the original 8, possibly fewer if the blizzard continued to work in her favor. The next 2 kills came within 18 minutes of each other, both at close range by her standards. 60 meters and 40 meters, respectively. Both were executed from positions she had established before moving to engagement distance, firing from locations the targets had not anticipated, repositioning immediately after the shot. The Springfield's mechanical simplicity was an overwhelming advantage now. There were no batteries to fail, no electronics to malfunction, no moisture to condense inside delicate optical systems. Just steel and wood and the understanding of how they work together. By the time the targets understood the direction of the threat, she was elsewhere. By the time they repositioned to counter, she had already established her next firing position. She was not hunting them the way they expected to be hunted. She was moving through the storm like something that belonged to it, that had learned its rhythms and its patterns, that could navigate by sound and memory when vision was reduced to arm's length. She found a depression in the hillside, shallow enough that lying prone, she was below the probable line of sight from the northeast, but deep enough that she could observe the tree line above her position. She needed 3 minutes to address a developing problem. The scope was fogging, not severely, just a faint condensation at the inner edge of the eyepiece, where the temperature differential between her body heat and the ambient air was creating moisture. She pulled a lens cloth from her chest pocket. It was one of 3 she carried, each in a separate waterproof container, each treated with an anti-fog compound she had mixed herself, according to a formula her grandfather had learned from a Navy optics technician in 1944. She breathed on the eyepiece gently, wiped it clean with smooth, circular motions, and checked the clarity. While her hands performed the familiar sequence, her mind went elsewhere. She was 9 years old in a barn in Montana. The smell of gun oil and hay, and the particular cold of a February morning that got into the spaces between things. Her grandfather, Nathaniel Thorne, showing her how to clean the Springfield for the first time. The rifle had seemed enormous in her hands then, heavy and serious and full of implications she did not yet understand. Ask correctly, and it answers correctly, he had told her, demonstrating the relationship between sear and hammer, the way the firing pin's mass and spring tension had been calibrated to deliver consistent ignition across a range of temperatures. Ask carelessly, and it answers carelessly. He had shown her the barrel's throat, the transition from chamber to rifling, and explained why the dimensions at that junction mattered more than any other single measurement in the weapon. A man with a $10,000 rifle and a poor understanding will miss, he had said. A man with a 50-year-old rifle and a perfect understanding will not. Evelyn cleared the scope and returned to the present. The count stood at 3 confirmed by her rifle. With the friendly fire incident, 4 down total, 4 remaining. But they were also, she suspected, beginning to understand that they were not the hunters anymore. She gathered her equipment, checked the chamber, and began moving east. The storm was beginning to thin at the edges. The wind had dropped slightly. The small, hard flakes were being replaced by larger, softer snow that fell more vertically. Visibility was increasing, which was both opportunity and risk. 20 minutes of careful movement brought her to a position on the eastern edge of the operational area. Here the terrain opened slightly, the trees spaced wider, with natural clearings created by rock outcroppings and slopes too steep for the pines to establish themselves. She could see at the limit of visibility, perhaps 120 meters, the outline of the ridgeline where she believed at least one of the remaining shooters had positioned. She waited. Patience was not a virtue in this context. It was a tactical requirement. Moving without information was how people died in situations like this. She needed to know where they were before she committed to an approach. The enemy gave her the information. A brief movement, just visible as a slightly darker shape against the gray-white background. Someone had adjusted position, perhaps trying to get a better angle on where they thought she might be. The movement lasted less than 2 seconds, but it was enough. She began a wide approach, gaining elevation, using the terrain to mask her movement. The snow here was wind-scoured in places, accumulated in drifts in others. She moved through the scoured sections where her tracks would be less obvious, avoiding the drifts that would slow her movement and create sound. It took 35 minutes to reach a position where she had line of sight on the area where the movement had occurred. The visibility had improved enough that she could see clearly to 150 meters now. There, partially concealed behind a cluster of young pines, was a white-clad figure. Professional setup, good position, difficult to approach from the south or west. But she was approaching from the east, from a direction the position had not been designed to defend against. The range was 160 meters. The wind was still variable, but predominantly from the northwest now, crossing from her right to left at approximately 5 kilometers per hour. The cold had deepened. Her estimate was minus 32 degrees, possibly colder with wind chill. She checked her hands. They were cold, but functional. The gloves she wore were thin enough to allow trigger control, but thick enough to prevent frostbite for limited periods. She had perhaps 10 more minutes before she would need to warm them. She settled into position, found the natural pause, let the reticle drift onto target. The shot felt perfect the moment before she took it. The trigger broke clean. The rifle reported. The white-clad figure collapsed. She was repositioning when she heard the radio transmission. It was coming from the dead man's equipment, close enough now that she could hear it clearly. A voice, controlled but tense. "Briggs here. I know who you are, Thorne. I served with your grandfather in operations the Marine Corps doesn't acknowledge. Korea and after. He taught me the 12-minute repositioning rule. I'm betting he taught you the same. I know you're moving. I know where you'll be." Evelyn froze. Maxwell Briggs. The intelligence estimate had been correct, and Briggs knew her lineage, knew the rifle, knew the tactics. The voice continued. "Your grandfather was the best I ever saw. Let's find out if blood holds true. Just you and me now. Everyone else is gone. Let's finish this properly." She did not respond. There was no radio to respond with, and even if there had been, words would accomplish nothing. But the situation had changed. This was no longer a tactical problem with multiple variables. This was a duel, personal, deliberate. Briggs knew her methods because he had learned from the same source. He would anticipate her movements because his training was identical to hers. Every advantage she had relied on, the accumulated knowledge of 3 generations, the understanding of the rifle and the terrain and the conditions, Briggs possessed as well. She checked the Springfield, cycled the action. The bolt moved smoothly despite the extreme cold. 4 rounds remaining in the magazine. More than sufficient. The question was not whether she could hit the target. The question was whether she could predict where Briggs would be while simultaneously avoiding being where Briggs predicted she would be. It was a problem of recursion, of thinking through the layers of anticipation and counter-anticipation until one of them made a mistake or one of them found an angle the other had not considered. She moved northeast but not directly. She used the terrain, the draws and the ridgelines, the areas where sight lines were blocked and sound was absorbed. She was breaking her own pattern now, deliberately violating the 12-minute rule. Briggs would expect her to follow it. That expectation was a weakness she could exploit. 15 minutes in one position, then a rapid move, then 18 minutes in another position, then a move again. The pattern was no pattern. The discipline was the abandonment of discipline. It was the kind of tactical improvisation that only worked if you understood the underlying principles so completely that you knew exactly which rules could be broken and which could not. The storm had passed entirely now. The sky was beginning to clear in patches, showing brief glimpses of pale gray light. The temperature had stabilized at something catastrophic, the kind of cold that made steel brittle and turned exposed skin white in minutes. But the visibility was good. She could see 200 meters in some directions. She found high ground, a granite shelf elevated 3 meters above the surrounding forest floor. From here, she could see the approaches from 3 directions. The 4th direction behind her was a steep slope that would make approach difficult and noisy. She waited. Briggs was out there, somewhere in the 270 degrees of forest she could not see. He was thinking the same thoughts she was thinking, predicting, countering, waiting for the mistake. 23 minutes passed. Nothing moved in the forest except wind-blown snow. Then, at the extreme edge of her vision, perhaps 190 meters distant, she saw something. Not movement, just the absence of something that should have been there. A rock outcropping that should have been visible was partially obscured. Briggs. He was using the same principle she was using. High ground, overlapping fields of fire, patience. The problem was that she had found him, but he would know that the moment she fired. The muzzle flash, even in daylight, would give away her position. And Briggs, with whatever rifle he was carrying, would have time to respond before she could relocate. Unless she did not give him time. She calculated the shot. 190 meters, elevated position, shooting slightly downhill. Wind from the northwest, crossing right to left at approximately 7 kilometers per hour. Temperature -34. Air density significantly higher than standard. The bullet would strike higher than the point of aim at this distance. She found the natural pause. The scope's reticle settled on the partially obscured outcropping. She did not have a clear view of Briggs himself, but she could see enough of the position to know where he had to be, or where she hoped he would be. The reticle wavered slightly. The wind was variable, the position uncertain. She squeezed the trigger anyway. The Springfield fired, and even as the round left the barrel, she knew the calculation had a margin of error. She was already moving, already repositioning, already preparing for the possibility that the shot had not ended this. The shot missed. She knew it the moment the rifle reported, knew it in the way a person knows when something fundamental has gone wrong. The bullet struck rock 6 inches to the left of where Briggs had been positioned, and by the time the impact occurred, he was no longer there. She was already in motion, moving downslope at an angle, putting distance and terrain between herself and the granite shelf where she had fired from. 3 seconds. That was how long she had before Briggs could acquire her last position and return fire. She covered 12 meters in those 3 seconds, dropped into a shallow draw, and became completely still. His shot came 4 seconds later. The supersonic crack passed directly over the position she had abandoned, followed by the sharp report of a high-powered rifle. Not a Springfield, something modern, probably .338 Lapua Magnum based on the sound. The round struck the granite shelf and threw rock chips into the air. Evelyn did not move. She was below the sightline now, concealed by terrain and the scattered pines that grew in the draw. She controlled her breathing, forcing it into the slow rhythm that would minimize the vapor cloud in the extreme cold. Her heart rate was elevated but manageable. This was the moment where training either held or collapsed, where the body either obeyed the mind or succumbed to the biochemical cascade of adrenaline and fear. She waited 2 minutes. Then she began a lateral movement, staying low, using the draw as cover. She needed to break contact completely and reestablish on her own terms. Briggs had proven he could predict her movements. That advantage had to be neutralized. The forest was silent except for the wind. Somewhere above her on higher ground, Briggs was making his own calculations. He knew she had moved. He knew approximately where she had been. He would be estimating possible routes of withdrawal, likely positions for her next shot. He would be doing exactly what she had taught herself to do, which meant she needed to think differently than her training. She found a position behind a massive fallen pine, the trunk easily 2 meters in diameter. The tree had come down years ago, judging by the weathering, and snow had accumulated on the upwind side in a drift that rose almost to the top of the trunk. She used the drift as cover and settled into a prone position with the Springfield resting on the wood. From here, she could see the granite shelf where she had fired from. She could see the ridgeline where Briggs had been. She could see perhaps 160 degrees of the surrounding terrain. What she could not see was Briggs. 5 minutes passed. The cold was becoming a serious factor now. She could feel it in her fingers, in her toes, in the exposed skin around her eyes. Frostbite was a real possibility if this continued much longer. But frostbite was a future problem. Briggs was a present problem. Movement. Not Briggs himself, but the effect of his movement. A small cascade of snow falling from a pine branch 80 meters to her northeast. Something had disturbed the branch. Wind could have done it, but the wind was not strong enough in this moment. Someone had moved beneath that tree, and the vibration had traveled up the trunk. She adjusted her position slightly, bringing the scope to bear on the area around that tree. She watched for the secondary indicators, the unnatural shadow, the shape that did not belong, the texture that was fabric instead of bark or snow. There, 60 meters from the tree, moving carefully between two rock outcroppings, a white-clad figure, visible for perhaps 2 seconds before disappearing behind cover. Briggs was flanking, trying to get around to her right side where the fallen pine would provide less protection. Evelyn made a decision. She could not win a static engagement against someone who knew her methods. She needed to create an asymmetry. She needed to do something Briggs would not anticipate because it violated the fundamental tactical principles they both shared. She stood up. It was the kind of decision that would get you killed in almost every tactical scenario. Exposing yourself deliberately, making yourself a target. But the expectation was so strong, the doctrine against it so absolute, that sometimes the violation itself created an advantage. She stood up from behind the fallen pine, the Springfield at her shoulder, and she moved. Not toward cover, not away from Briggs, directly across the open ground between her position and the rock outcropping where Briggs was sheltering. 40 meters of open snow. She counted steps. 1, 2, 3. Her peripheral vision caught the movement to her right. Briggs emerging from cover, his rifle coming up. She was at step 7 when she dropped to one knee, pivoted, and found him in her scope. The range was 90 meters. He was partially exposed, his torso visible above a rock. His rifle was oriented toward where she had been, not where she was. He was adjusting his aim, but he was adjusting to track her expected movement, and her actual movement had violated the expectation. She found the natural pause. The reticle settled on his center mass. The trigger broke clean. The Springfield fired. Briggs jerked and fell backward behind the rock. Evelyn did not wait to confirm. She was moving again, laterally, toward a cluster of pines that would provide cover. Her mind was already running the probabilities. Hit or miss. Fatal or wounding. Whether Briggs was down permanently or temporarily. She reached the pines and dropped behind the largest trunk. She cycled the action, ejecting the spent cartridge and chambering a fresh round. 3 rounds remaining. She controlled her breathing and listened. Silence from the direction of the rock outcropping. No return fire. No sound of movement. Just the wind and the settling of snow from branches disturbed by her passage. She waited 3 minutes. Professional discipline said to wait longer, to assume nothing, to treat every stillness as potentially deceptive. But the cold was becoming critical. Her fingers were losing sensation. Her core temperature was dropping. She needed to confirm the situation and begin movement toward extraction before hypothermia became the primary threat. She approached the rock outcropping from an angle, keeping the Springfield oriented toward the position, ready to fire if there was any indication of movement. 50 meters, 40, 30, still no sound. At 20 meters, she could see him. Maxwell Briggs, a man in his early 60s, lay behind the rock with his rifle 3 feet from his outstretched hand. The snow around him was stained red. He was not moving. Evelyn approached to within 10 meters and stopped. She kept the rifle on him while she visually cleared the immediate area. No one else, no secondary threats, just Briggs and the forest and the terrible cold. She moved closer. Briggs was dead. The round had struck him in the upper chest, just below the clavicle. His eyes were open, staring at the gray sky. He wore the patch of a unit that had been officially disbanded in 2003, though everyone in the special operations community knew it had simply been renamed and reclassified. His rifle was a custom precision system, probably worth $18,000 or more. The scope alone was $5,000. The thermal imaging system mounted on top was another $4,000. All of it rendered useless by the cold, by the moisture that had condensed inside the electronics, by the battery systems that had failed at -35 degrees. Evelyn knelt beside him and checked for a pulse, though she already knew what she would find. Nothing. She reached for his radio, a military-grade encrypted system still clipped to his vest. She keyed the transmit button. Firebase Coldstone, this is Captain Thorne. Patrol area secure. 8 hostiles neutralized. Requesting extraction at primary rally point. How copy? 3 seconds of static. Then Colonel Kellerman's voice, rough with an emotion he was keeping tightly controlled. Solid copy, Captain. Confirm 8 hostiles neutralized? Confirmed. Element is completely eliminated. There was a pause. She could hear background noise, other voices, the sounds of the operations center responding to the transmission. Captain, be advised your patrol has regrouped and is moving to the primary rally point now. ETA 20 minutes. Your status? Mobile, cold, functional. Understood. See you in 20, Captain. Coldstone out. She stood and looked down at Briggs one last time. He had been trained by her grandfather, had learned the same lessons, the same techniques, the same philosophy. But he had chosen a different path, had used those skills for purposes that had put him on the wrong side of this engagement. In another context, they might have been allies. In this context, one of them had to die, and the skill difference had been measured in inches. She turned south and began walking. The forest looked different now. The storm had passed completely. The sky was clearing in the west, showing patches of pale blue between the clouds. The temperature remained catastrophic, but the wind had dropped, which made the cold slightly more bearable. Snow covered everything in a fresh layer that softened the landscape, concealing the evidence of what had happened here. She passed through the area where the engagements had occurred. The disturbed snow, the brass casings she had ejected and not retrieved, the positions where the other members of Briggs's element had fallen. She did not stop to examine them. That was work for the recovery teams that would come later. Her job was finished. 28 minutes after her radio call, she reached the primary rally point, a logging road that had been cut into the hillside decades earlier and was now overgrown but still distinguishable as a linear gap in the forest. She sat on a snow-covered log and unloaded the Springfield. She drew a clean patch through the bore, inspecting it in the gray afternoon light. The barrel was still warm. Not hot, the action ran cool in extreme cold, but perceptibly warm against her fingertips. It smelled of burnt powder and cold air, and the particular scent that firearms acquire after use. She heard the patrol before she saw them. Blake Donovan's element moving through the forest with reasonable noise discipline, but not the complete silence that would indicate hostile intent. She stood and waited. They came through the trees and stopped when they saw her. Blake, Wyatt Sterling, Casey Sullivan, on an improvised crutch with his leg bandaged, and Garrett Hutchins. Behind them, a medic from the Firebase security element who had apparently joined the extraction team. The expressions on their faces went through several transitions in the space of a few seconds. Relief that she was alive, confusion about where she had been, something that might have been awe or might have been disbelief as they processed the implications of her radio transmission. Blake stopped 3 meters from her. He was a professional soldier with 10 years of experience, and his face showed that he was doing a calculation he had not expected to need to do. "How many?" he asked. 8. The word hung in the cold air. Blake looked at the rifle in her hands, looked at the forest behind her, looked back at her face. 8, he repeated, not a question, a confirmation that he had heard correctly and was trying to reconcile it with what he knew about tactical operations. The intelligence estimate was 8 to 10. I found 8. Nobody spoke. Garrett was staring at the snow, his face showing something complex. Shame, perhaps, or the particular discomfort of having one's assumptions proven catastrophically wrong. Wyatt stepped forward and offered her a vacuum flask. "Coffee," he said, "still hot somehow." She accepted it and drank. The coffee was terrible, field issue instant mixed with water that tasted faintly of the canteen lining, but it was hot and her body needed the warmth. She drank half the flask and handed it back. Casey, leaning on his crutch, asked the question that was probably in everyone's mind. How? The thermal didn't work in the blizzard. Neither did the drone, she said. Neither did radio. Neither did the complex optical systems on their rifles. When the temperature dropped below -30 and the moisture in the air began to freeze, everything that depended on electronics or battery power or precise mechanical tolerances began to fail. She held up the Springfield. "This doesn't need batteries, doesn't need electronics. The tolerances are generous enough to accommodate thermal expansion and contraction. It was designed for exactly these conditions." Wyatt nodded slowly. He understood what she was describing. The advantage of simplicity. The reliability of systems that had been refined through decades of use in every possible environment. Blake keyed his radio. "Coldstone, we have Captain Thorne. Entire element regrouped. Moving to extraction point." Kellerman's voice came back immediately. "Solid copy. Be advised, intelligence confirms all 8 targets are off the air. Element is completely neutralized." The hike back to the firebase took 90 minutes. They moved carefully because of Casey's injury, but also because the temperature was continuing to drop as evening approached. By the time they reached the wire, it was -38 degrees, and the sun was setting behind the western peaks. Kellerman was waiting at the operations center entrance. He watched the patrol come in, his eyes tracking each member until he found Evelyn. He did not smile, but something in his expression shifted. Relief, perhaps, or vindication. He walked to meet her as she approached. "Captain." "Sir, I need your after-action report when you are ready. But first, get warm, get food. The debrief can wait an hour." She nodded and moved toward the berthing area. Behind her, she heard Kellerman speak to Blake. 8 confirmed eliminations. Solo operation in extreme conditions against professional opposition. Make sure that gets into the official record exactly as it happened. The common area was warm after the killing cold outside. Evelyn sat in the corner that had become her unofficial space and began the disassembly and cleaning of the Springfield. The ritual was familiar enough that her hands could perform it while her mind went elsewhere, processing the events of the day, cataloging the decisions made and the outcomes achieved. Other soldiers from the detachment began to filter in. Some were curious, some were skeptical. All of them were quiet, which was unusual for a common area in the evening. The normal conversations and casual interactions had been replaced by something more careful, more deliberate. Sergeant Blake Donovan sat down across from her. "Captain, I need to ask, not for the report, just for my own understanding. How long have you been shooting?" "Since I could hold the rifle steady, maybe age 7 or 8. With this specific rifle, serious training, 25 years. Blake did the arithmetic. 25 years of dedicated practice with a single weapon system. The depth of knowledge that represented, the muscle memory, the understanding of every characteristic and quirk and capability. "My primary rifle," he said slowly, "I have been carrying for 3 years. I am good with it. I qualified expert, but 3 years versus 25 years." He trailed off, understanding something he had not understood before. Colonel Kellerman entered the common area, and the conversations that had been happening stopped. He walked directly to where Evelyn sat and placed a hand on the table beside her. "Your grandfather and I eliminated 12 hostile snipers between us over 3 days at Chosin Reservoir, he said, his voice carrying in the quiet room. He got 7. I got 5. We thought that was exceptional performance. Today you eliminated 8. Alone. In arguably worse conditions than we faced. He paused, and for a moment the 72-year-old colonel looked like the 18-year-old Marine he had been in 1950. 74 years ago, your grandfather asked me if mastery still mattered when the world got complicated. Today you answered that question definitively. Evelyn continued cleaning the bolt assembly. It only knows what you ask of it, sir. And you ask correctly, Kellerman said, because you understand it completely. He turned to address the room. I want everyone here to understand what happened today. Captain Thorne was inserted into a tactical situation against 8 professional enemy marksmen equipped with state-of-the-art weapons and optics. When environmental conditions degraded to the point where modern systems began to fail, her equipment continued to function because it was designed for exactly those conditions. But more importantly, her skills continued to function because they were based on fundamental principles rather than technological assistance. Garrett Hutchins stood up from where he had been sitting near the far wall. He walked over and stopped beside the table. His face showed the particular expression of someone who had learned something important in a way that would not be forgotten. Captain, I owe you an apology. I mocked your equipment. I questioned your capabilities. I was wrong on both counts. Evelyn looked at him, saw a 26-year-old soldier who had believed what he had been taught, that technology was the solution to every tactical problem, and who had just learned through direct evidence that the belief was incomplete. You believed your training, she said. Nothing wrong with that. Now you know there is another path. Garrett nodded. I want to learn. Not necessarily the Springfield specifically, but the way you think. The fundamentals underneath the equipment. First principle, Evelyn said, reassembling the bolt group with smooth, practiced motions. Master one thing completely before you acquire 10 things partially. Depth matters more than breadth when conditions become severe. She fitted the bolt into the action and cycled it, checking the smoothness of operation. The rifle had been fired 8 times today. It had functioned perfectly in temperatures that had disabled equipment costing 100 times as much. It would function perfectly tomorrow. It would function perfectly 10 years from now if it was properly maintained. The engraving behind the pistol grip caught the light. N.G.E. Thorne. 3 generations, 3 wars, 1 rifle, 1 unbroken line of knowledge passing from grandfather to daughter, each building on what came before, each refining the understanding a little more. The next morning, as the sun was rising over the eastern peaks, Garrett Hutchins approached Evelyn as she was preparing to depart the firebase. He was carrying his thermal scope, the housing still cracked from where it had been damaged during the cornice collapse. Captain, he said, I have been thinking all night about what you said, about mastering one thing completely. Yes? My younger brother died in a training accident 3 years ago. His rifle jammed. I have always blamed the rifle. Blamed the fact that the military issued old equipment. But I realize now that maybe it was not the equipment. Maybe he never learned to function without perfect conditions. Maybe if he had understood his weapon the way you understand yours, he could have cleared the malfunction, could have survived. Garrett looked at the broken thermal scope in his hands. I want to learn the fundamentals. I want to understand my equipment well enough that I can function when it fails. Evelyn studied him, saw genuine desire to learn, saw someone who had confronted the limits of his own knowledge and wanted to exceed them. The fundamentals are not secret, she said. They are in the manuals, in the training doctrine. But you have to be willing to invest the time, to understand not just how to use your equipment, but why it works. How long did it take you? Garrett asked. I am still learning, Evelyn said. Every time I fire the rifle, I learn something new. But the foundation, the basic mastery, that took about 10 years of serious, dedicated practice. Garrett nodded slowly. 10 years. She slung the Springfield over her shoulder. Most people want shortcuts. They want technology to compensate for lack of skill. Sometimes that works. Yesterday, it did not work. Kellerman appeared from the operations center. "Captain, your transport is ready." Evelyn picked up her pack. Garrett stepped back and came to attention. "Thank you, ma'am." She nodded and turned toward the helicopter landing zone. Kellerman walked beside her. "Your grandfather would be proud," he said. "He would say I just did my job, sir." "He would," Kellerman agreed. "But he would also know what it meant, what it proved." At the landing zone, Evelyn climbed into the helicopter without looking back. As it lifted off, she could see Kellerman standing at the edge of the pad, his hand raised in salute. Not regulation, the gesture of one old soldier to another across 74 years. The helicopter banked south. Below, the forest was white and pristine, already concealing what had happened there. Evelyn looked at the Springfield resting across her knees, the walnut stock worn smooth by 81 years of hands, the metal showing silver where the bluing had worn through, the engraving, N.G.E. Thorne. 3 generations, 3 wars, 1 rifle. Mastery had been questioned. Mastery had been tested. Mastery had answered. The forest kept its secrets. The lesson was proven. The inheritance honored. Ahead, the mountains stood silent in the cold morning light.